My beloved child, do not move away from these words yet. Something has been circling your heart, something you may have tried to ignore because you were afraid of what the answer might be. You have felt a distance you could not explain. You have noticed a silence that seemed heavier than ordinary silence. And somewhere deep inside, a question has been forming that you almost did not want to speak aloud. Has the person connected to my heart begun to love someone else? Pause here, because what appears to be happening on the surface is not the whole story. What you are about to hear was meant to meet you at the exact place where confusion has been growing, because there is a hidden layer beneath everything you have been seeing, and before this message ends, you will understand why the change in their behavior may not mean what you first believed. You have been watching signs without realizing how deeply they were affecting you. Perhaps their energy seemed different. Perhaps they became quieter, slower to respond, more distant, more difficult to understand. Perhaps there were moments when you wondered whether someone new had entered the space where you once felt certain you belonged. You may have imagined conversations happening without you, laughter you were not hearing, feelings being given to another person, promises slowly disappearing. And the more unanswered questions remained, the more your heart attempted to fill the empty spaces with possibilities. But listen carefully, beloved, because uncertainty can paint shadows where there are only unopened doors. What you have interpreted as an ending may actually be the beginning of a truth that has not yet fully revealed itself. There is indeed another presence around this story, but not in the simple way your fears may have described it. Someone has stepped closer to your soulmate during a vulnerable season. This person did not necessarily arrive with dramatic intentions. At first, the connection may have appeared harmless, comfortable, convenient, even supportive. They knew how to listen at the right moment. They appeared when your soulmate was carrying emotions they did not know how to explain. They offered distraction from memories that had become difficult to face. And because distraction can sometimes feel like relief, your soulmate allowed this person into a space that had previously been guarded. This is where appearances began to change. This is where the silence around you grew. This is where you may have felt something shift before you had any evidence that anything had shifted at all. But there is a distinction heaven wants this story to reveal. Being drawn toward comfort is not always the same as discovering love. Sometimes the heart runs toward what is easy because what is meaningful feels too powerful. Sometimes a person chooses a quieter connection because the deeper one awakens everything they have avoided healing. Your soulmate has been confronting emotions they once believed they could bury. Your presence in their heart has not simply represented romance. It has represented truth. It has represented vulnerability. It has represented the frightening possibility of being known completely. And for someone who has spent a long time surviving through emotional control, being truly seen can feel more dangerous than being lonely. This is why they tried to convince themselves that moving in another direction would be simpler. They believed that if they could redirect their attention, the intensity surrounding you would weaken. They thought distance would quiet the memories. They imagined that another person's presence might make your name feel less powerful inside them. For a brief time, they may even have believed it was working. They laughed when they did not feel like laughing. They agreed to conversations while part of their mind wandered elsewhere. They accepted attention because it asked less from them than genuine emotional honesty. They told themselves that peace meant not having to confront the depth of what remained unresolved between you. Yet something unexpected began happening. The more they tried to escape the emotional truth, the more ordinary moments began reminding them of you. A phrase someone spoke. A familiar song. A certain hour of the evening. A place they passed. A small habit they had forgotten you possessed. Even the way another person smiled could suddenly awaken a comparison they had not intended to make. They would be present physically, yet emotionally something kept pulling backward toward memories they had promised themselves they would stop revisiting. And this confused them, because they had expected distance to create freedom. Instead, distance began exposing attachment. There was one particular moment recently when this became impossible for them to ignore. They were speaking with this other person, and everything should have felt normal. The conversation was easy. There was no argument, no pressure, no visible reason for discomfort. Yet in the middle of it, your soulmate became strangely quiet. Something that was said reminded them of a conversation they once had with you, and suddenly they remembered the way you looked at them when you were trying to understand something they could not explain. That memory struck harder than they expected. For several seconds, they were no longer emotionally present where they were. They were somewhere else entirely, standing inside a memory of you. The other person noticed. They asked, perhaps gently at first, "Where did you just go?" Your soulmate tried to dismiss it. They said they were tired. They changed the subject. They smiled. They pretended nothing had happened. But that small moment planted a question inside the other person's mind, because people can often sense when someone's heart has entered a room where their body is not. From that moment forward, the energy between them began changing. What had once felt effortless became slightly uncertain. The other person started noticing pauses. They noticed that certain topics caused your soulmate to withdraw. They noticed there was a story that had never been fully explained. And eventually, your name came closer to the surface. Beloved, this is where the hidden truth becomes more complicated. Your soulmate has not spoken about you in the way you might imagine. They have not simply declared that you no longer matter. In fact, the opposite has been quietly happening. When asked about the past, they became unusually careful with their words. They avoided details. They spoke in unfinished sentences. They described circumstances but struggled to describe feelings. And when the other person finally asked whether there had been someone they truly loved, the silence that followed said more than any answer could have said. Your soulmate looked away. That silence carried you inside it. The other person understood more from that reaction than your soulmate intended to reveal. And suddenly, something that had seemed uncomplicated became emotionally dangerous for them. They began to realize they were standing near a connection that had history, depth, unfinished emotion, and possibly a future that had not yet been decided. They realized they might not be competing with another person in the present. They might be competing with a bond your soulmate had never fully released. Yet do not misunderstand what is unfolding. This is not a message asking you to wait helplessly for someone who cannot choose you. Heaven does not ask you to abandon your dignity while another person decides your worth. Your value does not increase when someone returns, and it does not decrease when someone becomes confused. The deeper lesson is about truth rising through appearances. You are being shown that what looks like rejection can sometimes be emotional avoidance, but you are also being reminded that another person's fear cannot become your prison. Love must eventually become action, honesty, clarity, and courage. And courage is precisely what your soulmate has been lacking. They know there are things they should have told you. They know there were moments when silence created wounds that honesty could have prevented. They know you may have interpreted their distance as indifference because they never explained what was truly happening inside them. What they do not know is whether they still have the right to return to that conversation. They wonder whether they waited too long. They wonder whether you have already closed the door. They imagine reaching toward you and discovering that the person who once cared deeply has finally learned how to live without them. That thought frightens them more than they admit. There have been moments lately when they have looked at their phone, considered reaching out, and stopped themselves. They have opened old conversations. They have reread words that once seemed ordinary but now feel heavier because time has changed their meaning. There is one message in particular that they returned to more than once. It was not necessarily dramatic. It may have been something simple, perhaps something kind you said during a difficult moment, perhaps something you wrote without realizing how deeply it would stay with them. At the time, they received it casually. Now they understand what was hidden inside it. You were offering them emotional safety before they even knew how much they needed it. This realization has disturbed the illusion that replacing the connection would be easy. Because the other person can offer attention, but attention is not always understanding. They can offer companionship, but companionship is not always recognition. They can be present, but presence alone cannot recreate the peculiar feeling of being known by someone whose heart once recognized the parts of you that words could not explain. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that the difference between you and this new connection is not simply intensity. It is depth. But depth creates responsibility. To admit they still feel something for you would require them to confront every decision that led to this distance. It would require them to acknowledge where fear spoke louder than truth. It would require them to explain why they withdrew instead of trusting you. And perhaps most painfully, it would require them to accept that you may not respond the way they hope. That possibility has kept them suspended between two worlds. One world where they attempt to move forward without you, and another where their heart keeps turning backward because something unfinished remains. Meanwhile, the person standing near them has begun to sense the conflict. At first, they may have tried to ignore it. They may have told themselves they were imagining things. But then another moment occurred, one that was far harder to dismiss. Your soulmate accidentally reacted when your name, your picture, or something connected to you appeared unexpectedly. Their expression changed instantly. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The other person saw it. And this time, they did not pretend not to notice. A question was asked. Your soulmate tried to avoid answering. The question was asked again. What followed was not an argument, but the emotional atmosphere shifted. The other person wanted to know whether you were still part of the story. They wanted reassurance. They wanted your soulmate to say that whatever existed between you was completely over. They wanted a simple sentence that would remove the uncertainty. Your soulmate could not give it. Imagine the weight of that silence, beloved. Not because silence guarantees reunion. Not because every unresolved bond becomes a relationship again. But because truth has begun dismantling the story your soulmate told themselves. They thought they had moved beyond you. They thought another connection would prove it. Yet when asked directly whether their heart was free from the past, they could not say yes. That was the moment everything changed. The person beside them realized that they were not entering an empty heart. They were entering a heart where a door remained unlocked. Your soulmate realized it too, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity. And now both of them are standing before the same uncomfortable truth: your absence has not erased your emotional significance. Still, there is more. Because what happened after that conversation has not yet reached you. Your soulmate left that moment carrying a strange combination of guilt, relief, fear, and longing. Guilt because they knew someone else had become emotionally involved in a situation they themselves did not fully understand. Relief because for the first time, someone had forced them to acknowledge the truth they had been hiding from themselves. Fear because admitting the truth internally meant they could no longer continue pretending forever. And longing because once your name had been spoken openly, memories they had worked hard to contain came flooding back. That night felt different. They could not settle their thoughts. They replayed moments between you, but this time their mind did not focus only on what went wrong. They began remembering what had been real. The conversations that lasted longer than expected. The moments when your presence calmed something in them. The times you understood their mood without being told. The strange familiarity they felt around you, as though some part of them had known you before their mind understood why. And then they remembered the moment they began pulling away. Beloved, that memory is important, because what you thought was the beginning of their loss of interest may actually have been the moment their feelings became too undeniable. There was something you did, something you said, or perhaps simply a way you looked at them that made the connection suddenly feel serious. Until then, they had been able to treat their feelings as temporary, manageable, undefined. But in that moment, they realized you had the power to matter deeply. And because they were carrying old fears, unresolved disappointments, or wounds from relationships they never fully processed, depth did not feel safe. Depth felt like risk. So they created distance. You may have blamed yourself for that distance. You may have wondered whether you were too caring, too available, too emotional, too quiet, too expressive, too hopeful, or somehow not enough. But their withdrawal was never a measurement of your worth. It was a reflection of their capacity at that time. They were not prepared to receive what their heart was beginning to recognize. The difficult part is that avoidance rarely removes truth. It merely delays the moment when truth must be faced. That delayed moment has arrived. Your soulmate is now looking at this other connection differently. What once felt like a possible escape has become a mirror. Every interaction is teaching them something about what they actually desire. Every comparison exposes what they tried not to compare. Every time they notice something missing, their mind returns to what existed with you. But something unexpected is happening inside the other person's heart too. They are beginning to understand that holding tighter will not guarantee your soulmate's feelings. In fact, the more they seek reassurance, the more your soulmate becomes aware of how uncertain they truly are. This has created a tension neither of them expected. Conversations that once stayed light have begun becoming deeper. Questions are being asked that your soulmate cannot answer casually anymore. Are you really here with me? Have you actually moved on? If that person came back into your life, what would you do? That final question stopped everything. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And in that pause, an image of you appeared in their mind. Not an idealized version. Not a fantasy. You as you were. Your flaws, your tenderness, your complicated emotions, your strength, your moments of vulnerability. They remembered the real person behind the memories. And something inside them broke open. They realized they did not know what they would do if you appeared again. Because a part of them had been secretly hoping you would. This is where you must remain centered, beloved. Do not allow this revelation to convince you that your life should be placed on hold. You are not being called to chase, persuade, compete, or prove yourself. The deepest spiritual shift happens when you stop measuring your worth by another person's confusion. If this bond is meant to transform into something healthy, they must approach you with clarity. They must arrive with truth, not half decisions. They must choose honesty over emotional hiding. And something is pushing them toward that choice now. Earlier today, or within the emotional timeline this story is revealing, your soulmate made a decision they had been resisting. They decided they could no longer continue allowing two different stories to exist at once, the story they were showing the world and the story living inside their heart. They knew somebody would be hurt by the truth. They knew there might be consequences. They knew the conversation could change everything. Yet they also knew silence had already created enough damage. So they began preparing to speak. But before they could say what they intended to say, something happened that completely altered the direction of the conversation. The other person spoke first. They revealed something your soulmate never expected them to know. They mentioned you. Not vaguely. Not indirectly. They knew a detail about you that your soulmate had never personally told them. For 1 second, your soulmate thought they had misunderstood. Then the detail was repeated. Their entire expression changed. "How do you know that?" they asked. The answer they received made their heart drop, because suddenly this was no longer only about whether they had feelings for someone else. It was about how much had been happening around your connection without either of you realizing it. The other person admitted they had learned something recently. Something connected to your past, your soulmate's hesitation, and the reason certain misunderstandings between you had grown when they should have been resolved. Your soulmate immediately demanded to know more. But the other person hesitated. They said, "Before I tell you, you need to understand something. What you think happened between you and them is not what actually happened." Your soulmate froze. Those words reopened every unanswered question at once. They thought about the distance. The timing. The conversations that never happened. The assumptions they had carried. The moments when they believed you had stopped caring. And suddenly a terrible possibility appeared. What if both of you had been reacting to a version of events that was never fully true? Their voice changed. "What do you mean?" The other person looked down, as though deciding whether revealing the next part would destroy whatever remained between them. Then they said something quieter. "There was someone else involved long before I came into this." Your soulmate's mind began racing. A name was about to be revealed. A name connected to the confusion. A person who had watched the two of you from closer than either of you understood. And when your soulmate finally heard who it was, they stood completely still, because the person being named was someone they had trusted enough to believe without questioning. But that was not even the most shocking part. The other person then reached for their phone and said, "There is something you need to see." A message appeared on the screen. Your soulmate read the first line. Then the second. And by the time they reached the final sentence, their hands had begun trembling, because those words suggested that the separation, the silence, and even the belief that you had stopped loving them may have been built around one hidden act neither of you knew had taken place. And now your soulmate knows exactly who they need to confront next.